This is 106.7, Wilmington's Big Talker, and my name is Paul Vallone. I'd like to welcome you to Guns, Politics, and Freedom, where each Sunday at 5 p.m., as part of the Sunday night political power block, we give you the ammunition to better defend your gun rights. In case you aren't familiar with me, I direct Grassroots North Carolina, or GRNC, since 1994, our state's most effective gun rights organization. As its director, I was involved in drafting and passing our original concealed handgun law. Since then, GRNC has gone on to engineer passage of concealed handgun reciprocity, our purchase permit bypass, castle doctrine and stand your ground, the expansion of concealed carry into state and municipal parks, restaurants, public assemblies, educational properties, and much more. Grassroots North Carolina is exactly what the name implies, a grassroots collection of people from all walks of life who share a common concern that our constitutionally guaranteed freedoms are being eroded. Check us out at grnc.org. That's grnc.org. Today, we are lucky to have as our guest internationally renowned researcher Dr. John R. Lott of the Crime Prevention Research Center. Back in the 1990s, Dr. Lott did the original research which produced the surprising and then surprising conclusion that adoption of shall-issue or non-discretionary concealed handgun laws actually reduces rates of murder, rape, and aggravated assault. That work eventually became the book More Guns, Less Crime, Understanding Crime and Gun Control Laws. As an academic who didn't have a political agenda, I recall that Dr. Lott was surprised to discover that immediately the political left wanted to discredit him, resulting in his nearly 25-year battle to get truth into the hands of the American public with respect to gun policy. Dr. Lott has produced the seminal research not only on concealed handgun laws, but on multiple victim public homicides and the impact of so-called gun-free zones. His most recent undertaking is the relatively new Crime Prevention Research Center, through which Dr. Lott is regularly quoted on Fox News, Wall Street Journal, and countless other national news sources. Lott is the author of no less than 6 books, I believe, primarily on the topic, the most recent of which is The War on Guns, Arming Yourself Against Gun Control Lies. I'd like us to offer a warm welcome to Dr. John R. Lott. Welcome, John.
It's good to talk to you. Thanks for having me on your show.
I
think it's actually 9 books.
I'm sorry, say it again?
9 books.
9 books. Okay, I missed some. All right. Well, I didn't see them all on your website. 9 books. Now, I'm truly impressed.
Well, not all of them have anything to do with crime or guns.
Yes, as a matter of fact, I was going to mention that. Unless I missed my guess, you became involved in this topic at around the time that I became alarmed enough about trends in public policy to actually found a gun rights organization on my part. While you've been a researcher searching for the truth, I've been the foot soldier out there trying to implement your findings into public policy by passing and expanding concealed handgun laws. As such, I have followed your career with great interest. And as you mentioned, you're an economist by trade, so what brought you to the topic of gun research?
Well, I'd done a lot of work on crime. Basically, economists have one simple notion, and that is if something's more costly, people do less of it. If there is a greater return, people do more of it. And you can apply that to everything from the price of apples. If the price of apples go up, people buy fewer apples, or they'll buy more oranges or something, to crime. If you make crime riskier, more costly for criminals to commit, they'll commit less crime. And just as you can make it riskier for criminals to commit crime with higher arrest rates or higher conviction rates or longer prison sentences, the fact that a would-be victim might be able to go and defend themselves also makes it potentially risky for criminals to go and commit crimes.
Right. Yep. That makes intuitive sense, and unfortunately, I think I often wind up debating people for whom logic is not, I guess, their strongest suit. But since then, since you initially started your research, it's been a bit of a battle to get the truth out into the media and elsewhere. Why don't you tell us a little bit about that? What kind of reaction have you seen?
Well, I guess it's been all over the place. My book, More Guns, Less Crime, has the various editions have a couple chapters that kind of deal with the reaction that occurred afterwards. And everything from Charles Schumer, when he used to be in the House, claiming that I had done the research because I'd been paid by ammunition maker, or that you have all sorts of attacks from Media Matters to the Bloomberg groups. It's just you just run into stuff all the time, and just hope. And in fact, I think it's in part because of all the misinformation that I've heard over the years about guns that's kind of drawn me much more into the debate than I would have otherwise. Normally in my career, I've done a lot of work in a lot of different areas, and I probably would have moved on to something else within a year or two if it hadn't been for kind of the attacks and the misinformation about guns generally that was out there. I kind of figured if I wasn't going to address it, nobody might. So
interesting. Okay, well, thank you for addressing it. I guess that's sort of serendipitous on the part of those of us who want to implement successful public policy that actually reduces violent, predation. And I remember some of the early debates long before you and I spoke. I watched some of those debates, and quite frankly, the opposition had nothing fact-based to say to refute arguments. So instead, they did what the left is so prone to do. They started attempts at character assassination. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, well, I mean, they still do that, but I guess it's just part of the thing. I mean, obviously they do that to lots of people, and I hope it backfires sometimes when they do it. Sure, there are plenty of politicians who have had more than their share of those types of attacks.
Unfortunately, I can understand that from politicians. What I find very unfortunate is when people try to do objective research on a topic, and I think you've probably found this too, it seems like there's very little objective research on gun issues now. Most of it is agenda-driven, I guess, as one article put it, that's designed to validate preordained political conclusions. Has that been your experience lately?
Well, there are different levels of quality research, but there surely is a lot of pretty poorly done research out there, whether it's done purposely poorly or they just don't understand the tools to be able to do it. I suppose that's up to individuals to decide. But, I go through a lot of the stuff in my latest book, The War on Guns. But, I'll just give you a simple example. There's some claims that some public health researchers made about gun ownership rates in states and shootings of police officers. And they claim to find a positive relationship there. The thing is, when you go and you do those types of studies, there's certain basic factors that you always account for. Two of them are what we call fixed effects. Basically, that's saying that you want to go, let's say crime rates are falling nationally between 2 years, let's say 2006 and 2007. You want to see whether or not a state that's changing its law or changing its gun ownership rate is seeing a drop relatively faster or relatively slower than the rest of the country. You just don't want to end up accidentally having a lot of changes in a point in time where everything's changing nationally and you're just falsely attributing that national trend to whatever factor you're looking at. And so what you do is you kind of have a way of pulling out the average national change there and seeing whether there's a change relative to that. Well, they included what we'd call the geographic differences, the averages across places, because Idaho and California can vary for lots of different reasons that have nothing to do with a gun law or what have you. And you try to account for that for different variables, but you also want to kind of pull out the average difference. So they only included the ones for the different areas. They didn't include the one that we were just talking about for over time.
Okay.
And
John, I'm going to ask you to pick this up after the break here for just a moment.
Well, I was almost finished. I mean, it actually caused them to get the opposite result, and it's hard to believe that they wouldn't have known that when they ran the regressions.
Yeah, I believe they probably did know that. So, you've been listening to Wilmington's Big Talker 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com, rather, and I am Paul Vallone, your host for Guns, Politics, and Freedom. We're going to take a short break, after which we will return with Dr. John R. Lott of the Crime Prevention Research Center and his research on concealed handgun laws, gun control, and public safety. So join us after the break for Guns, Politics, and Freedom. You are listening to Wilmington's Big Talker 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com, and I am Paul Vallone, your host for Guns, Politics, and Freedom. Right now, we're returning with Dr. John R. Lott of the Crime Prevention Research Center and his research on guns, concealed handgun laws, gun control, and public safety. Welcome back, John.
Well, thanks for having me on.
One hot topic has been the use of guns in domestic terror attacks in the United States, after which gun control advocates immediately called for restrictions on semi-automatic firearms, barring gun purchases to people on the so-called terrorist watch list, and more. I know you've done a fair bit of research on this. What has your research revealed with respect to the impact of gun laws here and abroad on terrorism?
Right. Well, kind of go through a lot of this data in my book, The War on Guns. What you find, in fact, is that the rest of the world is much worse in terms of mass public shootings, in terms of the frequency, and particularly in terms of the casualties from these types of attacks than the United States is. It's just that the rest of the world doesn't really get that much of attention. And, of course, there are other types of attacks. There's bombings and what have you that you really don't see in the United States, that you also see quite a bit in the rest of the world. Even Europe has had a large number of mass public shootings that don't get a lot of attention. If you look at it in terms of casualties from mass public shootings, Europe is much higher. So you have the European Union during the Obama administration had a casualty rate from mass public shootings per capita that was about 50% higher than the casualty rate in the United States over those 8 years. And they had a very similar frequency that we had in the United States. Of course, there are individual countries in Europe that have much higher rates, particularly when you adjust for population. But even take a country like France, for instance. In 2015, the 4 mass public shootings that they had there had a total of 532 casualties. This is a country that's about 1/5 the population of the United States, and yet they had more casualties in 1 year from mass public shootings than the United States had over all 8 years of the Obama presidency. Over all 8 years, the casualties from mass public shootings in the United States was 527. So, it's really remarkable. And, of course, outside of Europe, it's much, much worse. And we can't even be sure that we've gotten all the cases because
I am Paul Vallone, and you are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker 106.7, WilmingtonBigTalker.com. Our guest today is Dr. John R. Lott of the Crime Prevention Research Center, and he is discussing his research on concealed handgun laws, gun control, and public safety. John, we were just discussing your recent report on the explosion of concealed handgun permit holders and some of the demographics and who's benefiting from that. Why don't you tell us a little bit more about that, if you could, please?
Right. Well, as we're mentioning, you've seen a huge increase in concealed carry permits, and nationwide, there's been a move towards a lot more women and blacks as well as other minorities getting permits. And that's understandable. Not only does it kind of correspond to the research that's out there, but in terms of who benefits the most, but it also is consistent with a lot of polls that we've seen showing that both women and blacks, for example, have changed their views on guns over the last 20 years. They're much more likely to believe that guns make them safer now. In fact, the majority of both women and blacks think that owning a gun is more likely to increase their safety than to reduce it. But even though that kind of change in permits is occurring across the nation generally, there are areas where it hasn't changed. In fact, you see very few women, very few minorities getting permits, and that tends to be in the so-called may-issue states. So you have two different types of states. You have the right-to-carry states, where once you meet certain objective criteria, you're a certain age, you pass a criminal background check, you pay your fees, do your training. Once you've met those criteria and you want to get a permit, then it's automatically granted to you. The other 8 states are what we call may-issue states, and in those states you have to demonstrate need to some local public official. And what you find is that in those areas, which tend to be heavily controlled by Democrats, very few permits are given to women or to minorities. Los Angeles County, we were able to go and get information on concealed handgun permit holders there. We got the list of names. And what you find is that only 7% of permit holders are women. Only about, even though the county has about half is Hispanic, only about 6.5% of permit holders in Los Angeles County were Hispanic, and only 5% were black. Okay. So, it's kind of ironic in the sense that Democrats will claim that they care about poor and what have you, but living in a dangerous part of the county does you absolutely no good in getting a permit. And even having death threats isn't enough. It's basically you have to have some good reason by their measure, and you also have to be politically powerful, wealthy, well-connected individuals, it looks like, in order to get permits. A lot of the permits that they give are to judges, but then the small group that they give to private citizens are basically wealthy, politically powerful white males. You see the same practice in places like New York City. Heads of labor unions, presidents of labor unions many of them have concealed carry permits. Arthur Schulzberger, the publisher for the New York Times, has a concealed carry
You're
permit.
Kidding me. Now there's irony for you.
Right. Donald Trump obviously had a concealed carry permit, or has.
Yep.
But you see people like Robert De Niro and Howard Stern. But you see people like John Stossel, who used to work for Fox. Stossel went in a couple years ago, had a whole range of death threats that he documented and showed to the police there, and lots and lots of what seemed to me like serious death threats. But the police would say, well, we just don't think any of these rise to a sufficient level of concern on our part that we're going to give you a concealed carry permit.
Mighty nice of them on their part, huh?
Right.
I grew up actually in one of those may-issue states, and so before moving to the free state of North Carolina here, so I can attest to that. As a matter of fact, now that you mention it, and strictly this is apocryphal, but I don't recall ever meeting a female concealed handgun permit holder in New York State when I lived there. Not that I can recall anyway. Now, some of the organizations like the Violence Policy Center claim that concealed handgun permit holders are responsible for crimes. They even have a report they call Concealed Carry Killers. I mean, what have you found with respect to concealed handgun permit holders with respect to crime?
Well, I mean, when you consider the fact that there's about 16.4 million concealed carry permits, you're going to find a few crimes committed by permit holders, but the rate is incredibly low. I mean, it's hard to find, I would argue, any other group in the population that has as few problems, few crimes committed by them as you see with concealed carry permit holders. So, for example, police are very rarely convicted of crimes generally and very rarely convicted of any firearms-related violations. And yet, for crimes generally, permit holders are convicted at about 1/6 the rate for states that we have data like in Florida and Texas than police are.
1/6 of the rate of police. That's amazing.
And about 1/10 the rate of police when it comes to firearms-related violations.
No kidding.
And so, it's, you look at some of these states and, you have like 1.2 million permit holders in Texas. You imagine, even if you didn't have a concealed carry law, there'd be a few of those people who would go and commit crimes anyway. In 2016, you have 8 that were convicted of any type of aggravated assault out of 1.2 million. I don't know how many of those involve firearms, which would kind of be the only relevant category there, but it's probably no more than 3 or 4 of those cases. And so, if you had 1.2 million, I assume even if you didn't have concealed carry laws, there'd be a couple convictions for firearms-related violations. So it's just amazing how incredibly law-abiding those individuals are.
Awesome, and that's gratifying to hear. As a matter of fact, as a concealed handgun instructor at one point myself, that to know that I was, I guess, not only helping to reduce violent crime, but rather that the people getting those permits are, as we've always said, overwhelmingly responsible. Now we're gonna have to break.
I mean, they have a lot to lose. They have a lot to lose. Here you have very law-abiding citizens who go through the process, and if you use the gun improperly and become a felon, your life is going to be unalterably changed.
That's an excellent point. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about North Carolina. We'll split this across the break, so we'll pick it up again after the break. But here in North Carolina, we are engaged in a fairly vicious debate over adoption of what other states have called constitutional carry, namely enabling citizens to carry concealed firearms without having first gone through the burdens of obtaining state-mandated training for a concealed handgun permit. One of the arguments being made by our opposition, which includes an organization I know you're familiar with, namely billionaire Michael Bloomberg's Every Town for Gun Safety, they're arguing that the law would negatively impact public safety because people would be carrying firearms without state-mandated training courses. Now, you've done some research on that topic, I believe. Can you tell us what you found? And as I say, we may have to break it off, but we'll pick it up after the break. What have you found about that?
Well, I mean, there seems to be a fair amount of evidence that even when training's not mandated, people get it. And you see this in different ways. So when states have adopted constitutional carry, you find evidence that even though the number of concealed carry permits may fall or not grow, the number of people who actually are signing up for training classes increase fairly dramatically. But, in my book, More Guns, Less Crime, I've also gone through and looked at states, because there are states that issue permits, some of them that don't require training, like Indiana, for example, and Pennsylvania, a number of states like that. And you don't find any difference in revocation rates, mistakes or wrong things that people have done with their guns in the states that allow or that have training versus the ones that don't. And this gets back to a point that we were making earlier, and that is what you find is that you're talking about very law-abiding citizens who have a lot to lose if they go and do something wrong.
Okay.
And so they are very careful. They go, in fact, one could even argue they're too careful in some ways, but in terms of making sure they know the rules and get training, they do that in any case because they have so much to lose.
Got it. All right. You've been listening to Wilmington's Big Talker 106.7, wilmingtonbigtalker.com. My name is Paul Vallone. You are listening to Guns, Politics, and Freedom today on Wilmington's Big Talker, 106.7, wilmingtonbigtalker.com. Our guest today is researcher John R. Lott of the Crime Prevention Research Center, and he is discussing his research on concealed handgun laws, gun control, and public safety. As I had mentioned before the break, we are debating in North Carolina House Bill 746, which would, among other things, adopt permitless concealed carry, as well as giving some improvements to concealed handgun permit law, to the permit system, which would remain still intact, and also would run some public education for children in schools on firearms. But with respect to the permitless carry, we've had some objections that concealed, or the permit, the people carrying firearms without permits would not be getting the state-mandated training course. And so, John, you've determined that people that in states which have adopted constitutional carry are actually getting that training regardless. I believe you said that it'll likely be 16 or 17 states that allow people to carry concealed handguns without a permit this year, I guess. Is that right?
Well, we have 14 states right now that either in all or almost all of the state don't require you to have a permit to carry. So you have 12 states where you don't have to have a permit in any part of the state except for maybe like in Idaho to carry on university property. You have to have a permit. And then you have 2 states, Arkansas and Montana, where in most of the state, like in Montana, you don't need a permit outside of city limits. There are really only 6 cities in Montana, but within the city limits you need to have a permit. So that's like 99.4% of the state. You don't need to have a concealed carry permit.
Got it.
But so you have like 14 to some degree or another right now.
All right. And what has your research indicated with respect to gun accidents in those states, since obviously my opposition would claim that gun accidents should increase because people are not getting the state-mandated training? What's your experience?
Yeah. Well, I find no evidence that training seems to affect that, or at least mandated training. As I said before, I think people who carry concealed have a lot to lose by behaving improperly, and they realize that. And so they may get training on their own, some type of informal training, or they may go and sign up for classes anyway, even if they're not mandated. As I